Let me start with gratitude. Gratitude for the amazing people who, with less than 24 hours notice, showed up to do the readings here today, and to Spencer and the amazing music that you brought us. And to this congregation who holds me on my path to ministry and offers up this opportunity to be here in the pulpit again. I feel blessed and thankful. By Langston Hughes. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? Or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat? Or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags a heavy load. Or does it explode? This poem keeps repeating itself in my head and heart these days. And of course, I know why. And so do you. Our nation has just experienced a huge explosion. Let me take that back. Is experiencing, present tense. The violence visited upon Michael Brown is far too common, far too familiar for anyone to think that this is beyond the pale or highly unusual. And maybe you have heard and were shocked, or maybe you already knew and are cynical and afraid. But since 2006, on average, in this nation, in this so-called home of the free, twice every week, a white police officer has killed a black person. We mourn Michael Brown, and we stand with his family. We mourn all these dead. And we cannot be surprised by this explosion, by its force or intensity. It comes as the latest in a much too long litany of young African-American men, men of color, and some women too, who are killed extrajudicially, which is a big, official, obfuscating word for outside the due process of law, which is otherwise known as murder. Eric Garner last month in Staten Island, Ezel Ford in Los Angeles 2 days after Michael Brown. The numbers grow, mostly young, people of color killed by police officers or citizenry emboldened by cruel laws purporting to be about self-defense, but too often are instruments of racialized fear and violence. Originally, this morning, I was going to talk about my experience interning as a hospital chaplain, where I saw more than enough death, often caused by violence. And instead, I choose to preach the headlines. We are choosing to preach the headlines, and still, I want to preach about prayer too. UU minister and author Kate Braestrup writes this about prayer. I can't pretend to be unconditionally in favor of the practice of prayer. No, I've got plenty of conditions. I'll pray only as long as prayer helps me to be more present, more aware and attentive, and as long as prayer helps me to see the suffering of others. As long as prayer reminds me to deploy both my resources and my generosity, I'll pray, and I will keep on praying so long as prayer serves as a uniquely potent means of giving and receiving love. Still, if someone is starving, for God's sake, don't sit around praying. Give him food. The same goes for water, warmth, rest, and the Heimlich maneuver. She's funny. You should read her. To assert that prayer is always, under all circumstances, the first thing love should do, or even the best thing that love can do, is irresponsible at best and a self-serving lie at worst. Still, if someone is being shot dead in the middle of the street, unarmed as they are, with their hands in the air by a police officer, for God's sake, don't let it happen again. So with that in mind, with all these stories and commentaries about Ferguson, about racial inequality, gun violence in the hands of police, tear gas and rubber bullets, I want to share with you a story about prayer and the power of prayer, and prayer in Ferguson. The Reverend Willis Johnson is a pastor at the Wellspring Church in Ferguson. And apparently there is a photo of him out there in social media land, one I haven't been able to locate. And it's of him hugging a young man, Joshua Wilson, one of the protesters, a young African-American man he had never met before. In the midst of the protests, there they are hugging. And when interviewed by NPR, here is what Reverend Johnson said about that embrace. I just embraced him, because he was so angry. You could feel it in his body. You could feel it in his speech. And I have a newly turned teenager, and I've been Joshua before. Something just said, grab him, hold him, maybe initially to keep him back, but ultimately to become what is really symbolic of the situation at hand. People who are hurting need to be affirmed in their anger. People who are hurting need to be affirmed in their hurt. People who are angry need to be affirmed in their anger. Let me say it like that. I needed that as much as he needed that. We kept each other from harm's way and from doing something that we need not do. Reverend Johnson continues. Well, one of the things I shared with them is that I understand that I know you want to, I know you want. You've got to channel this another way. Not to discourage protest, not to discourage expression. That was never the case. If anything, it was to affirm him and to affirm both of us. Because in that moment, we were both being disaffirmed. We were being told and suggested that what we were doing was wrong, and it was not wrong. People are feeling, I believe, empowered by the fact that there are others who feel passionate like them. And it's hard for people who are not there to maybe understand why someone would choose or channel that need or mode to express themselves. I don't fully understand it myself. But what I do understand is what it means to be that angry. So I'd rather, if you're going to fuss and cuss and be mad, I want you to do it with me. Do it in my ear. And then here comes the prayer part. And at the same time, I just began to pray with him. Give him the strength. Give us the strength to be courageous enough not to do what they expect us to do. What does courage look like? I, here in this body, this white woman, I couldn't hug young Joshua, not there. It would have a different message. But Reverend Johnson could, and I am so thankful he did. Let me be clear, though Reverend Johnson suggests, as one black man talking to another, that courage in that moment is resisting the strategy of violent protest, I do not think this is the only courageous choice at all times and in all places. Sometimes courage is the renunciation of violence, more often than not. And sometimes, given imperialism, given authoritarian strains, given oppression in its many forms, courage is and can be the intentional and skillful use of it. I say this with what I hope is an appropriately uneasy sense that it's likely right that is not especially desirable. Either way, as someone who lives a racially privileged life all the hours of my days, it's not really up to me to measure or judge, and certainly not to dictate. I have entered only recently, and the storyline of the current violence started long ago in our nation's racial history, as Ta-Nehisi Coates quoted earlier said. Now we have half stepped away from our long centuries of despoilment, promising never again. But still we are haunted. It is as though we have run up a credit card bill and, having pledged to charge no more, remain befuddled that the balance does not disappear. And the effects of that balance, interest accruing daily, are all around us. So if, as one of our readings says, safety and respect and equality look different depending on race privilege, on gender identity, on class affiliation, then what does courage look like for you at this moment, here in this life, in your life, in the context of our nation on fire? In an interview just a few weeks before she died, the great sage Maya Angelou said that, quote, courage is the most important of all the virtues, because without courage, you can't practice any other virtue consistently. You can't be consistently fair, or kind, or generous, or forgiving. Any of those without courage. So how do we, as Unitarian Universalists, live into the bookends of our 7 principles? The one that says each person has inherent worth and dignity, and the other that says we are all part of an interdependent web of being. How do we find the courage to do what it takes, not just to believe in those values, not just to say them out loud, but to live into them, to embody them? Especially if our privileges, whatever they are, provide protections from the harm of this systematically unjust society that allows fear turned to hate to fester and run, allows it to stink like rotten meat, allows it to be a heavy load on the most vulnerable among us. So what does your courage look like? How will you notice who matters and who does not? And change that in yourself, in your neighborhood, in your nation, in this world. Whatever it is, and there is a handout attached to your order of meeting that gives you specific ideas if you would like them. May you find yourself praying or affirming or risking your way there. May we all find our way there sooner, much sooner, because it is already later. Amen.